Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give that another try. I am delighted to be with you this afternoon in what I was saying is a critical moment in history. We're experiencing a degree of upheaval and I think opportunity for transformation unlike we've seen in my lifetime and I think many other people's lifetimes as well. And so this is an important moment for us to think about how emerging technologies, and in particular in this case XR, is a position to help us think about how we design and reimagine our societies. As I was preparing and thinking about the purpose of my session today, I decided that I had more questions than answers that were coming up for me. So I first want to start with just posing some questions to you for your own reflection as you think about the moment we're in as it relates to racism and anti-racism. So I'll, ask you to think about why now, why for those of you who are recently coming to and really grappling with issues of racism in our society in any sort of substantial way, why now? Why did it take so long for you to recognize the inequalities in our society? Were you paying attention and listening before? Were you resistant to accepting the realities of racism? And if so, why? Why has it taken repeated public lynchings, social and political upheaval to get you to this point? When will you stop listening, do you think? When will you stop marching? When will you return to the comforts of the privileges that you perhaps temporarily stepped away from to see and participate in this moment? For me, and I say this not any ounce of disdain, but it is absurd in some ways that some of you are only getting here now. We have always lived in this place. Racism has always existed and functioned in this way. And I want to use the word absurd, and I want you to grapple with that absurdity because it's critical to come to terms with that in order to move forward and progress in a meaningful way as it relates to the work of anti-racism. So I'm glad that you're here. Welcome. But really think carefully about these questions. And my hope today is to provide you some guidance for change and how we might actually successfully implement change. But there's some questions tied to that as well. Why do we want change? What are we trying to change? What do we mean by change? Change in what form and for whom? How is change actually achieved? Are we operating out of any specific theory of change, or are we sort of just going with our gut instincts and good intentions and letting that lead the way? And I would argue that that's potentially very problematic. Have we thought about who has the power and time and resources to address and design change? Question whether you're the best person who's best equipped to promote change in the areas in which you're working. And if not, how do you need to pivot and perhaps change your team and modify the direction that you're taking? Your answers to these questions will shape everything that you do, from the subsequent questions you'll ask, from the answers that you'll seek, the people you hire, the content you produce, and certainly how you engage change. So I encourage you to think about the ways in which your reflections, as you reflect on these questions, the ways in which it's shaping how you're thinking about these issues. So when we think about how we practice anti-racism, I wanted to offer some guidance, some pathways for thinking about how to achieve this work, and then briefly talk about the ways that I've done this in my own work. First, it's important to acknowledge that race does not cause or influence anything. When we're thinking about racism, it's not membership in a racial group. It's not checking the box Black. It's what comes along with those lived experiences of being Black, white, or holding other positionalities and identities that shape the things that we're trying to understand in society today around white supremacy and racism. Also, your empathy related to these issues, feeling bad about these issues, are really insufficient and don't really do anything for the public good. We really have to focus on action and how you're integrating these principles into the work that you're doing and the change that you're trying to achieve. Another important component of this is moving beyond individual bias, not only thinking about what's internally in my head in terms of my own biases, but thinking about how racism functions in society. It's also important for us to not use racism light language. When we mean racism and we're talking about complex systems, we want to not use bias, diversity, microaggressions. They're not synonyms for what racism is. And if you think that they are, there's some work to be done around understanding how racism functions. Another important component is to not avoid race. If you are truly invested in change, if you're truly invested in your work in gaming or XR, to if someone could mute their mic, if you're really invested in change through the work that you're engaging in, I would argue that investing in colorblindness is not really a solution. And in fact, it's a form of racism, pretending that race doesn't matter or that it only matters for the oppressed group over there and not accepting any responsibility for your role in relationship to those things matters in that regard. And there's also an important component of not focusing on your individual designation as racist or not. It's not really about you and your feelings and your designations. It's really more about anti-racism. And it's an important distinction because the focus on you as racist or not is really kind of grounded in some degree of narcissism, focusing on yourself, how people see you and perceive you, as opposed to doing the work to fight against issues of racism. So I would argue that anti-racism is more action-oriented, focused on behavior, policy change, and the content that we produce. Anti-racism is also not a badge, it's an orientation. So I've seen a lot of people claiming this identity. I am anti-racist, posting it as part of their social identity, their social media profiles, etc. And I would argue that that's more of a symbolic representation than doing the real work of focusing on what's most important. The other things to remember is that there's no neutral in this space. If you're coming to terms with the significance of racism in our society right now, there's no sense that you get to be independent or exclude yourself from the realities of that. You are very much grounded in racism as it's functioning in our society. Sometimes my students will say, I've never experienced racism, and I push back and say, you've absolutely experienced racism, just another side of it, and it's operated in an invisible way in your life that it's important for you to grapple with and come to terms with. So in the time that I have remaining, I wanted to give you a sense of the work that I've done with the 1,000 Cut Journey in collaboration with Jeremy Balanson of the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford University, a sense of the what, why, how, and who that we've been pursuing. What we've done is create an immersive digital experience that puts you in the shoes of a Black male as a child, adolescent, and adult, experiencing racism in different forms over time. And I've talked quite a bit about this work over the past couple of years. And I think what's important about this experience is that we're trying to find a way to connect you in a more personal and visceral way to the realities of racism, acknowledging that if you don't live in the world in Black or brown skin and have been raised under this sort of colorblind model, you're not very likely to have come to grips with what this means in one's lived experience in day-to-day life. And so we wanted to create an experience that would help people grapple with this more explicitly. And when I say people, getting to the who, we focus specifically on white liberals. So we were focusing on a group of people who espouse beliefs of justice and equity, but who we felt needed to be engaged more deeply, both in terms of their ideology and beliefs and thinking and unpacking those things critically, but particularly in terms of their action and behaviors. In my experience, a lot of people talk the talk, but don't walk the walk. They miss everyday opportunities to engage and grapple with and do something about racism and how it manifests in our day-to-day lives. The process that we engaged for this work was one that I describe as transdisciplinary, and this is also important. A transdisciplinary approach creates a non-hierarchical process for developing content, be it in games or XR. This approach says that it's not only computer science or the programmers, but it is the psychologists, the social workers, the people who are grounded in the communities that we're trying to engage around change need to be at the table from the very beginning, creating this content together, not just in sort of brief consultations, but really integrating their perspectives and expertise into the work that we're trying to create. Otherwise, we run into the danger of misrepresenting, missing the mark, and perhaps even doing harm and damage when we intended to do some good, but we needed and we're missing expertise at the table. That was an important part of that work. The ways in which we're thinking about how are we applying a 1,000-cut journey to questions, to the question of change? How are we using this tool that we've developed? And I have to say at the outset, we really thought of this as an exploratory undertaking. Is it possible to create something meaningful around racism in VR that doesn't feel like entertainment? Even if we're drawing on principles of gaming, even if we're immersing you in an interactive digital experience, can we create something that feels substantial and meaningful? And I wasn't sure if we would be able to do that in the beginning. And I think it's in part because of the team that we had of artists, computer scientists, social workers, psychologists, etc., working together, we were able to create something that I think is quite powerful and meaningful. The way that we're using this, we, myself and Jeremy, are both psychologists by training. We have run several studies where we're trying to get a sense of what happens to people when they go through an experience like this, and how do they change over time? Do their beliefs shift? Do they analyze problems of race in society differently? Are they changing their behaviors? Are they changing the ways that they reflect on themselves as a result of going through this VR experience? And we're finding evidence that that is certainly the case. And it's happening not just for whites. In fact, we're seeing it across multiple racial groups who have been through the VR experience. So we've been using this in classrooms, working with educators and instructors to think about curriculum that fits the VR piece that we created and will help students unpack the significance not only of what they've just experienced in VR, but translate that experience to society and what's happening in front of our very eyes. We're pushing social workers to think about how they can use how they're reflecting on their experiences in VR and use that to shape their practice as social workers. And that requires intervention outside of the headset. So the VR can serve one function. It can create emotion. It can create deep connection. It can give you perspectives. You can embody worlds and perspectives that you never embodied before, but you need to do something with that when you come out of the headset in order to really translate that, I think, into something meaningful. So again, for us, the approach we're taking is partnering with educators and others who really understand how to approach some of these things to help us be more successful in that effect. We've also partnered with corporations across different industries, medicine, law, the tech industry, to think about this as a training tool. So for people who are the senior leaders in an organization and are shaping the directions that their companies are going next as it relates to anti-racist practice and work in organizations, we've started using the virtual reality along with things that happen again outside the headset to help guide some of their thinking, framing, and strategic planning in that space. And so I think those types of partnerships and engagements are pretty critical. Lastly, what we're working on next is taking what we've learned with the 1,000-cut journey and trying to reimagine how we might represent a complex narrative of that sort in VR. We've been working with Ink Stories, for instance, who are filmmakers and storytellers, to see how they would partner with us to create this a deep, rich, interesting experience in virtual reality. We're also integrating data visualization into the narrative. So we want people to, once they've gone through the narrative, to come back into that space and start to interact with it in a way that will really start to help them understand the significance of structures and systems in producing the racial patterns that we observe in society. Why are Black people more likely to be infected and die from COVID-19? How do stop and frisk practices shape mental health and incarceration patterns in a community? We can talk about that in terms of data and numbers, but what we're exploring is, can virtual reality help us visualize structural racism in a way that enhances people's understanding and thus has a better effect on their behavior and what they do after they've gained that understanding? So I always like to close my talks with this framing that emerged for me very early on in this work and trying to understand why I was doing this. For those of you who have heard me talk about this before, I had never used virtual reality when I first wrote the proposal to fund this project, but had an idea that being able to walk in someone else's shoes might be an important way to engage these issues, and with the right set of partners that I would be able to pull it off. But the insight that came from me, the belief that emerged for me, was that achieving racial justice really requires that we understand what racism is and how it functions, and not an understanding that emerges only from intellectual exercise or even in the consumption or production of science and data, but rather a visceral understanding that connects to spirit and body as much as reason, one that connects to your soul. And so I think me in doing this work and essentially creating a virtual gut punch to try and wake more people up to what we're actually dealing with as a society. Hopefully it doesn't take the continual help us understand what we're actually dealing with. And hopefully we can start to translate that this is not just a matter of policing, it's housing, it's education, it's health. This infiltrates every aspect. And it's not a problem for Black and brown people to solve. It's a problem that everyone needs to engage in order for us to stand any chance for democracy to be. So thank you very much for joining me today. We'll be going over to a Q&A. I believe someone's going to post a link to that room in the chat. And I believe we'll have about 15 minutes for any additional questions that you might have. And I look forward to speaking with you. Thank you.